Good morning, everybody. Very glad to see you here. It is the 10th summit, and Jason has certainly laid out a great agenda for the day. I think we'd all agree it's a packed and compressed agenda. And he included what we're going to talk about right at the beginning, because he talked about how power demand is one of the really crucial issues. And very pleased to be able to talk about it with Lynn, who is chairman and CEO of Duke Energy, which operates in the Carolinas, in the Midwest, and in Florida, and serves, I think, Lynn, about 10% of the total American population, providing them with the energy they need. So welcome. I thought we'd start with demand. If we were meeting a year ago, we wouldn't be talking about electricity demand growing the way it is, and I think I saw that even demand in your own regions is growing faster than projected even a year ago. What's happening?
Yeah, Dan, thank you, and it's really an honor to be here with all of you. Electricity demand is something that we've been spending a lot of time on, thinking about the topic of electrification in general. But I would say to you, over the last 18 months, the expansion of demand has extended far beyond electrification. So think about the CHIPS and Science Act. Think about onshoring of U.S. manufacturing. Think about domestic content provisions in a lot of our renewable and electric vehicle requirements that have brought onto shore Toyota battery manufacturers, chip manufacturers, not only in the Carolinas but also in the Midwest. And just expansion of onshore manufacturing capability for those during the pandemic that were challenged with supply chain overseas. And they've made some decisions to bring those operations onshore. Then you add to it electrification, electric vehicles, and we are seeing demand at a pace that we have not seen probably since the 80s or 90s in the Carolinas. You could think of our industry as being kind of a flat to a 0.5% growth level now. In the near term, we're looking at 1.5 to 2, and we think it'll even be beyond that. And in the Southeast, I would also say we are benefiting from in-migration that really started during the pandemic.
People leaving New York.
People leave, maybe New York, maybe Connecticut, maybe other places. But last year, we set 200,000 meters in the Carolinas and in Florida, which, if you look around the landscape of utility companies in the U.S., it's about the size of a small utility, just population growth coming into our areas. And so you look at that combination, and we are really spending a lot of time on how do we serve it. What is our existing capacity and what capacity can we add?
So I want to come to what you're doing about it, but just tell us, like chip manufacturing, semiconductors, are they electricity intensive?
Oh, yes, yes. And you mentioned artificial intelligence. There's a lot of discussion going on around data centers also. And every one of these chip manufacturers, onshoring of expansion of a battery manufacturer, a data center supporting artificial intelligence, all of them are 24/7 power users.
Yes. So, as you said, long time flat demand, very slight growth. Suddenly you're looking at strong growth, and mentality has to change, and what else changes?
The planning has to change, Dan, and you mentioned a moment ago, we operate in regulated markets which have integrated resource plans, which is a kind of a complicated word for tell us what it's going to take to serve the load that you see over the next 5 years, the decade, 15 years, 20 years. And between August of last year and January of this year, we actually updated plans in the Carolinas because of this extraordinary growth. And we're only capturing in the growth where dirt is turning because the manufacturing plant is underway, or we have a signed letter of intent for someone moving to our area. There's a pipeline of discussion and economic development that is beyond that we have not yet planned for.
So, will you?
We are planning.
Okay.
But we're waiting to, in a disciplined way, Dan, so that we're not building too quickly, so that we understand fully what the requirements are, and that will be an ongoing approach. But just the magnitude and the power demands that these manufacturers and data centers and others are bringing to our service territory really requires us to pay attention to be able to serve them.
Right. Do you think, has public policy caught up with it, regulators and so forth?
I think everyone's getting their head around it. Dan, and I know in the markets that we operate in, there's a very thorough process to look at who the customers are, what is the demand, how does that fit with the rest of your requirements. And that's really the beauty of an integrated resource planning process. It's a very open process. There will be intervention, there will be public hearings, there will be thorough discussion about what is the right approach to serve. But there is no question in the Southeast, we need to build generation.
Right. And to build generation requires money, and I note that you have a $73 billion capital expenditure program, and about half of that is going into the grid. Why?
So the $73 billion is the capital plan for Duke Energy over the next 5 years, and half is going into the grid to enable all of the things that we're talking about. It's a combination of things. I would say reliability and resiliency front and center, but also preparing the grid for generation in new places, renewables, electric vehicles, greater capacity of that system. And also cyber and physical security is front and center for an infrastructure.
We'll come back to that for sure. So in terms of the spending, is it the same equipment that you've been putting up? Is the technologies of the grid changing?
Technologies are changing. It's making the grid smarter. You hear that term, smart grid. But the intent is to make it more resilient, to give us better information, to give us an opportunity to manage outages differently so that we can sectionalize and we can minimize the amount of time that a customer experiences outages. And these technologies are proving over and over again how effective they are. We can actually track the number of minutes that we've saved our customers. And particularly in a hurricane zone like Florida and the Carolinas, we've been able to reduce outage restoration by days as a result of these technologies and hardening of the grid in a way that makes it easier to respond.
And what about permitting?
Oh my. So permitting, and this is an audience that understands building infrastructure, I know. But permitting is a challenging part of building infrastructure. And it is true that it can take longer to get the permits than it can take to build the infrastructure. And so we are supporters of, is there a common sense way to improve coordination at the federal level, to expedite the pathway? And frankly, is there a way to address litigation risk in a way not to in any way stop the challenge of permits and other things, but to allow the time to be expedited in a way it can be thoroughly reviewed. And as I talk about all of this, this is not intended to shortcut or eliminate engagement with stakeholders, engagement with communities, honoring and taking care of the environment in a way that we all care deeply about. But I believe you can accomplish all of those things in a more coordinated and accelerated time frame so that that part of the process can be completed so that the infrastructure can be built.
And do you find that's happening?
There are modest steps forward, and IIJA being an example of that, Dan, but there's more to do. There's just frankly more to do.
Right. So while you're meeting this demand growth, at the same time, you have a very strong focus on decarbonization.
Yes.
And so I thought we might talk about what you're doing, what the elements of your decarbonization strategy are, beginning with renewables.
Sure. We have set targets to be, of course, net zero by 2050, net zero methane by 2030, out of coal by 2035, and building renewables every step of the way, battery storage. We are the largest operator of regulated nuclear plants. We have 11 reactors in the Carolinas. We are working to extend those lives and then also looking at how we can bring in additional nuclear technology in SMR, for example. So it is an all of the above strategy, and frankly, Dan, that path is being challenged by all of the growth, and what are the decisions we need to make in the near term to meet the growth while also maintaining trajectory on carbon reduction. So that is a point of great discussion to do.
Because obviously you have the renewable strategy and suddenly you're also having to deal with growth and adjustments.
Yes, and staying on path to retire coal by 2035.
Right.
These are all dynamics that we're wrestling with.
Right. In terms of renewables, in your areas, wind or solars or?
So in the Carolinas and in Florida, it's solar. and battery storage, a lot of battery storage. We are targeting 30,000 megawatts of renewables and 10,000 megawatts of batteries across our system by 2035. Some wind in the Midwest. We're beginning to look at offshore wind off the coast of the Carolinas, but I think all of you here in the Northeast have seen some of the challenges for offshore wind, so we're being thoughtful and deliberate about that. But it's largely, from a renewable standpoint, solar with batteries.
So you made a strategic decision to get out of, call it the commercial solar renewable business, and focus only on the utility business. That was a big strategic decision. What was the thinking behind it?
Yeah, you know, Dan, we started a commercial renewable business in 2007 where we were building renewables all over the U.S., a combination of wind and solar, battery storage. And frankly, with all of the growth that we're talking about, as well as our aspirations to transition our generation fleet to net zero, we were looking at a lot of capital competition within the family between the regulated business and the commercial business. I know financing will be a topic today, but we have to make choices, and made a choice that we would continue our investment in the regulated business, more consistent really with the investors that follow Duke, and we would therefore put the commercial renewable business in the hands of an owner that is incented to let that business grow to its full potential. So it was a decision really around capital allocation and choices on how to grow the company.
Right. And you said in the Carolinas it's solar. What about in Indiana and Ohio?
A little solar in Indiana and wind, Dan. Ohio is a deregulated market, and we only own wires. Oh. So not almost no generation being built in Ohio.
Right. So on nuclear, certainly much greater optimism and focus on nuclear than we've seen a few years ago. Tell us a little more about your thinking about SMRs and what's reasonable to think about.
Dan, we are a very big supporter of nuclear at Duke Energy. If you look at the history of our company, we were one of the innovators around introducing nuclear technology decades ago. And today, in the Carolinas, 50% of the power comes from nuclear, carbon-free, runs all the time. One of the cheapest forms of energy that we provide to our customers. And so we are in the process of pursuing second license renewal on all of those units. We have invested in them and operated them in a manner that makes them eligible for that and will continue. We think that's critical to our path to net zero. But we also believe that decarbonizing capacity, meaning at some point, as I retire coal and as gas trends down, I need something that has that dispatchable characteristic that can run all the time, that can match the needs of a 24/7 user of power. And nuclear has those operating characteristics. So we are working actively on small modular technologies as well as advanced nuclear technologies that have storage capacity with them. We are developing an early site permit on a location, actually at a place where we're retiring coal, so the transmission infrastructure is there and will make that more viable.
Everything, yeah.
Yes. But as I look at the permitting and I look at the construction, and I look at the stakeholder process, and I look at the licensing process at the NRC, that SMR is probably 2035 and later.
Right. And are you developing your own technologies or working with?
Working with OEMs.
Right,
yes.
Right. Something, of course, what is it? Globally, about 44% of the nuclear fuel comes from Russia. Is the U.S. affected by that?
This became an issue, as you can imagine, at the time of the invasion of Ukraine, Dan, and there's been a lot of work done in the industry to move away from Russia, Duke being one of them. So that's an important part of the nuclear fuel cycle, is something we spend a lot of time on. But it's contracted, and there are other sources giving us assurance we can operate without Russia.
Right.
For a long period of time.
Right. And of course, you're retiring coal, and you're not only do you provide electricity, but of course you also provide natural gas to customers. And there's a question of natural gas and generation. How do you see the role of gas in this environment of A, decarbonization, but B, growing demand?
You know, it's an interesting question. It's a good question, Dan. And I know natural gas can be a difficult topic in the context of what does it mean to a net zero goal and what does it mean to decarbonization. But I would say a couple of things. First of all, natural gas has been an important part of the decarbonization that we have already achieved. So Duke is down 45% from 2005. It has largely been retirement of coal and introduction of natural gas. Of course, renewables have played a part, but that dispatchable, run all the time nature of natural gas has made it a real benefit to decarbonization. And then as we look at the next many years trying to find a way to expand a system to approach this growth, I think natural gas has a role to play. And when I think about a Toyota battery manufacturer and a chip manufacturer and artificial intelligence and the desire to retire coal as quickly as we can, I believe there will be a role for natural gas. I also recognize that carbon capture, hydrogen, renewable natural gas, finding a way to decarbonize that is going to be important in the 2030s, into the 2040s. But frankly, we need the bridge fuel. We used to call it the bridge fuel. We need the fuel to get from here to the future, to get from here to the SMR, to get from here to a commercially available hydrogen or commercially available carbon capture. And that does not mean in any way that we aren't investing all that we know to invest in energy efficiency, in solar, in battery technology, pump storage facility, all of these things. But in all of the above strategy is the only thing that we see is the way to maintain the reliability and the affordability that our customers count on.
So you mentioned both battery storage, hydrogen, what you're doing in research. On battery storage, do you have 2-hour duration, 10-hour? What do you see happening
So
there?
on average, 4, Dan, is what we're working with right now. And then we have kind of an R&D facility that's looking at a lot of additional chemistries that could be longer than that.
So you have your own R&D facility?
Yeah, actually it's a facility that is connected to our grid, but also gives the OEMs an opportunity to experiment with us. Right. So we'll bring in their technology, we'll develop a use case for it and see how it works. The most powerful battery that we own is a pump storage facility. Pump the water to a reservoir and then drain the water.
And you have two.
Well, we have one very large one with multiple powerhouses.
Right.
But it's interesting how the operating characteristics of that asset have changed over time as we've introduced more and more solar and have more and more variability on our system. That pump storage, which used to be a one-time up and a one-time down, is now cycled many, many times a day. Many, many times a day. And it is a very powerful tool. We have the opportunity to expand it, and we think there might be a business case to do that as we add more and more renewables. But that balancing characteristic that it represents is really powerful for maintaining reliability.
So have you always had the pump storage? I mean, if everybody understands what you're doing is you're...
Yeah, so since the early 90s.
Yeah.
Since the early 90s.
You pump the water up and then come down and generate power.
Yes, it was actually built with the idea that we would use nuclear power in the evening when load wasn't as great. You use nuclear to bring it up, and then you would use it during the day to meet peak demand. That's why it was built. That was the business case back in the late 80s. And now it's a very different business case. It's managing solar today.
And it's very interesting also that, I mean, you have to cycle it up and down, that managing it, the unit differently.
Yes.
Yeah. Last year, a lot of excitement about hydrogen, still excitement about hydrogen, but maybe slightly different perspectives. What do you all think in Duke about the role of hydrogen? Or have you formulated a clearer view yet?
I believe hydrogen will have a role to play, but there's some work to do. I think anyone who has spent time on this recognizes that we're still in the early development, not yet commercially available, not at scale. If you think about the amount of hydrogen you need for blending of generation of power, quite substantial. But we are piloting. We have a solar plant, an electrolyzer producing hydrogen connected to a peaking plant in Florida, so we're learning a lot about the operating characteristics of hydrogen. We also were the recipient of a grant from the Department of Energy on carbon capture. We have a gasification plant in Indiana where we are studying carbon capture. The geology actually exists in Indiana for sequestration, so it's kind of a great place to begin experimenting with that technology. And then, as I said, we're working on SMRs. We see our role as the operator, providing valuable insight into how these technologies can be used in the operating environment to meet their full potential.
So a question from the audience that follows on what you said a little earlier is, what role does AI or can AI play in making the grid smarter, and pros and cons of using AI for this purpose?
It's a really good question, and we have been using various forms of AI for several years, and I'll give you an example of that. So we use a drone technology to scan solar fields looking for aberrations. So it's collecting data, it's comparing that data to what we know a functioning solar farm should look at, it's highlighting issues so that we only dispatch repair after the comparison occurs, and now you send somebody to repair or replace a panel. So that type of thing has been used for a long time. We also believe there will be a way to work with all the data with smart meters, with smart technologies on the grid. Is there a way we can figure out how to optimize? Is there a way we can figure out how to more effectively dispatch crews when there's an issue? Can we get ahead of things? I know a lot of our Western colleagues, I see Maria in the audience, are doing a lot of work around wildfire detection. Is there a way we can use some of these technologies to get ahead of data and figure out how to be smarter on anticipating what might happen? We have a disciplined approach on how we're using AI to really test the business case. It's technology and business working together. Let's pilot, then let's move more aggressively when we think the business case is there. But it represents so much potential that we have to see what is possible, because we want to, operate our assets as effectively as we can, and we want to do it at a low cost.
Right. Well, you mentioned resiliency a little while ago. Let's talk about physical resiliency and cyber resiliency. Obviously, you mentioned hurricanes as a big concern. Just how are you addressing resiliency, and how do you think about it?
It is an everyday assignment, Dan, frankly. And many of you may have followed in December of 2022, it was a Duke substation that was fired upon. So the Moore County site where a transformer was taken out of service was one of our facilities. And it's just a reminder that, things happen, whether a physical attack of some sort or a cyber attack, and we always have to be ready. So there are investments going on all the time, risk-based, assessing where we have vulnerability, and then moving investment, moving people, et cetera, in those areas. We do so in a partnering way, very close to the government agencies that care deeply about cyber and physical security for infrastructure. So from the FBI to CISA, et cetera, very, very engaged. And then we spend a lot of time on recovery. If something happens, how do we respond, and how do we respond quickly? So drills, not only within Duke and with partners, but also as an industry, because we appreciate the critical nature that we play as an infrastructure provider.
And what about cyber?
So cyber is a big deal. There have been national standards for cybersecurity related to our industry for some time. And that is because of the implications if our system is taken out to, the New York region, the Charlotte region, et cetera, just extraordinary impact. And so, it's the 24/7 operation, it's increasing investment, not only to detect, but to defend, and it's the partnerships I've talked about, Dan, where we are constantly exchanging information on how we can get better, how we can get ahead of threats, and then drilling for recovery.
And drilling also for cyber threats as well.
Oh, absolutely. Ransomware, cyber threats. In fact, every couple of years, the industry drills on a combination of physical and cyber attacks. And you get a scenario. So, there's a fire, there's a terrorist attack, there's a cyber attack, and then we work together on how we would respond to that particular situation.
Right. So you're talking about the manufacturing that's coming into your area. How is the IRA? I mean, are you feeling the impact?
We are and are thankful for it. Dan, the IRA includes incentives, as all of you know, around renewables and nuclear, that for a company like Duke, those credits go right to customers to reduce the cost of electricity. And so if you think about this moment where we're not only building to meet the growing electric demand, but we're also building to transition our fleet and introduce renewables and battery technologies and other things, every dollar of those credits go to our customers. And so solar, some of the solar credits are already going to customers in Florida, and then we're awaiting regulations on nuclear. We began earning those January 1st of this year. And for an important fleet that we're trying to renew licenses for another 20 years, those credits will be particularly valuable.
Those nuclear plants, if you renew them for another 20 years, that means 80-year operating life for them?
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
So the IRA is really one of the engines that's driving the demand growth that you're seeing.
I would actually say some of the infrastructure, the CHIPS Act is also driving demand.
Yes.
So it's been a broad array of policy, frankly. The IRA has made renewable investment more attractive, and that's important to our transition to net zero. But it has also made the nuclear provision helping for second license renewal and introduction of new nuclear technology.
So with this growth, we started with growth. What does that mean in terms of challenges, in terms of supply chains, inflation, and people?
Challenges in every area, Dan.
Right.
The inflation that you all see in your personal lives, that inflation is showing up in every project that we're pursuing, whether it's the equipment itself or the EPC provider, the engineering procurement, labor. We have segments of the labor force that need to be rebuilt in order for us to do what we're doing. So think about welders and pipe fitters. We actually have put programs into community colleges throughout our system to develop and train line and service techs, the individuals who are making all the investments on the grid. That workforce was turning over, retiring, and new people were not coming as quickly as needed. So we've actually rebuilt that pipeline. Right. We're going to have to do that over and over for the trades in order to pursue this opportunity.
Right. So last question, you operate in Florida. You operate in a big way in the Carolinas. You operate in Indiana and Ohio. What's it like operating in these three very different regions?
Dan, I would suggest that regional differences are something that we really need to think about, not only when it pertains to growth, but our aspirations for the future. Because every one of those regions have different renewable characteristics. Solar's good some places, wind not so much, wind good in some places. The legacy existing infrastructure is different in each of those places. So there's coal in the Midwest, built near where coal was mined over the years. There's a lot of gas in Florida. It has been the powerhouse of Florida. There's nuclear sitting in the Carolinas, 11 reactors within driving distance of the Carolinas. So you have to respect that when you think about how am I going to move forward, whether it's decarbonizing, whether it's pursuing growth. And we have found that customizing solutions in each of the areas to meet the aspirations of those states and enabling what they're trying to accomplish is a key role that we play. Right. And so there is no silver bullet. You all know this. There's no single technology. There's no silver bullet. There's no single solution that'll work for every state. But working with them in a customized way to take advantage of the resources and to honor what they're trying to accomplish, we have found to be a way to work with policymakers and customers.
Well, I guess that's a very big takeaway. No single solution, particularly in an environment where demand is surprising people by exceeding what they'd experienced for the last 20 or 25 years. Please, everybody, join me in thanking Lynn Good for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.